Hey guys, it's Donald the Solo RPG Guy here. In part 2 of my experiment of converting over to Fantasy Age, the RPG experiment, I was thinking, okay, you saw my first video where I talked about where I was using Dungeon Saga cards to generate a random dungeon for myself. And it got me thinking about, okay, what happens after the dungeon? Or, if you want to go the other way, how does the party get to the dungeon? So I was thinking, well, the best way would probably be doing some type of hexcrawl. Now, as I'm sitting there thinking, the first thing that came to mind was Forbidden Lands. Now, you've probably seen my video on this. I actually have several on Forbidden Lands. But I was sat there thinking, well, this is an RPG designed specifically for hex crawling. So let's take a look and see what we can do to utilize Forbidden Lands in our little conversion to Fantasy Age. I typically do this exact same thing as far as other RPGs as well, but for this experiment, Forbidden Lands to Fantasy Age. So let's take a look. Forbidden Lands has a tendency to be my default for several reasons. First, the setting itself. Basically, Big Bad Guy has created this nasty mist that has covered the lands and made it very unsafe to travel. Recently, those mists have lifted, and adventurers and various people are going out in the world to stake their claims, establish trade routes, and everything that a civilization would need to do, especially after being cooped up for hundreds of years. With the recent recent pandemic, a lot of you can feel that pain. We've only been, supposedly following isolation for a couple of months. Imagine being in total isolation for 300 years, how bad you'd want to go out. So I usually use that setting as my backdrop. The mists have lifted, and now people are ready to run out into the world and claim their fortunes. Now, the next thing that comes to mind, well, we need a map. Or you can randomly determine your map, but luckily for us, Forbidden Lands comes with this nice, neat map. I'm sorry for that glare there. Let me move this, see if I can adjust the light just a little bit. Okay, it's a little bit darker, but at least you don't have the glare as bad. You still got a lot of glare. Let's see here. You notice it's already broken down into hexes for you. So let's say, for example, that little marking there represents your first dungeon. There's your starting village. You now have the hex map that you can start exploring to explore this new world. So typically, this is my default map for when I do hex crawls. Oh, and I'll throw out another little side note here. Another reason why I like to use the Forbidden Lands. Here in a couple months, they're coming out with a new setting where you travel up north into the cold, desolate areas. That kind of gives a Frostgrave, Skyrim kind of appeal. So I'm looking forward for that to come out. But yeah, we first use this map here and use it as our hex crawl. We normally pick a starting village, a starting dungeon, and that's where we're going to begin our little endeavor. Now, since we're using Fantasy Age as our RPG of choice, the mechanics of Forbidden Lands gets tossed out. However, we do have all these great charts that we can use to create our world, at least to start. Start by building yourself a village. Roll on this little template, roll on this chart here. Find out what size village you're going after, or you're not what you're going after, but where you're at. And then you get things like when it was built, some oddities, a problem that is usually a good thing to start your first dungeon with. Combine the problem with whatever your dungeon is. So let's say night wargs. Okay, apparently there's some night wargs in a nearby dungeon. Why are the night wargs there? Maybe they belong to bandits. You can just use your oracles to answer some questions about, you know, why the night wargs are there, or what, you know, the sinkhole, bandits, terrorizing monsters, slave trade, haunted by ghouls or ghosts. You have, there is your initial start to get you out thinking about that dungeon. Then you've got, you know, your claim to fame, your village oddities, your institutions, what's available in that particular village. You can come up with a name for your village. And if you don't feel like using this chart, you can always pull out whatever other charts you got. Sometimes I will pull out the Ironsworn book or the Dungeon World book, so they have name generators in there as well. And now you want to look at the dungeon itself. You can see when you roll on the chart to see when it was built. The size of the dungeon to give you an idea of how many rooms might be in that dungeon. What was its original purpose? Who built it? Maybe a little bit of history of the dungeon. And then, of course, its inhabitants. And then, of course, if you roll on the chart. If you don't have appropriate miniatures, make some up. Just use quarters, squares, dimes, whatever. This will tell you what type of monsters you come across. An entrance to the dungeon. And then, of course, you got your dungeon generator. If you don't have Dungeon Saga, but you have this book, you can still use this to generate your dungeon. Now, I skip this usually because I'm using the Dungeon Saga cards just because I like cards more than I like charts. And then, of course, if needed, I can always default to this for traps, dungeon oddities. And then we get into castles, but if we come across a castle, then we can start rolling on these charts. But concentrating solely on the dungeon portion, you now have a history, brief history of the dungeon, who's in there, what type of problem they're causing for the village. And then using your oracles and your other charts, or your GM Master Emulator, or your GMA cards, you can start to develop a story. Now, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to decide where. I got still that glare. Let me see if I can lower that glare any. Okay, it's coming from the camera itself, so alright, we'll just have to deal with the glare. But the best thing to do is pick a spot that would be the your starting point for the village. So let's just say we pick that spot. Now, I know this game comes with stickers that you can put on your map, but I would really hate to ruin this map in any way, shape, or form. I like it just the way it is. So if you look at the map, at the top, you got some letter combinations to tell you what grid, and then along the side, if I can get this in here, along the side, you got some numbers. So let's just go back to and look at our map. And we've picked our starting point as here. So that winds up being AE. It's like 46 or 47. I'm gonna go with, let's see here. That's 49 and that's 50. So 50, 49, 48, 47, 46, 45, 44 AE. We then will pull out our notebook. And I know you can't see it, but we will just go that well anyway. We will just go hex 45 AE village. Now at this point you can pull out whatever you want to name the village. You want to give it a name. Typically this is the starting village. This is where the PCs have grown up. So I will go ahead and usually give it a name. And then the next thing you want to do is simply go back to your book and let's roll this stuff up and see what happens, just to see. Grab some dice here. Now we already know it's a village, so we don't have to roll on that chart. If the size of a village is important, we can figure that out. And I just rolled a 2. So we have an outpost. Obviously our characters grew up in an outpost of some type with 5 to 20 inhabitants. Alright, so we will annotate on our notes that we're at an outpost. Okay. Next, the age of the village. We got our handy dandy dice here. 13. It was before the blood mist, so we know it's a very old outpost. We will go ahead and write that down. Before the mists. Just in case that becomes an important factor later on. The ruler of the village. 53. He's a cunning village elder. Actually, he's a cunning 15. He's a cunning despot. Oh, that's not good. We've obviously been living under some rough rule. Maybe that's why we're leaving. Problem with the village. 34. Undead. Its claim to fame is 23. Some type of craftsmanship. Let's see, what kind of village oddity we get? 41. It's always windy here. Now we're going to roll on institutions. Apparently, though, we only get one roll on the institutions. And we get a 46. Apparently, there's a forester. Now, at this point, I'm thinking, obviously, this village's claim to fame is probably some type of crafting wood and objects of some type. Just keep that in the back of our mind. And then, of course, if we need the inn, the name of the inn, we can do that. I'm not going to do that right now. But let's go ahead and see what that first dungeon is all about. It's probably plagued with undead. See, we're already thinking that since that's the closest dungeon on the map, our first encounter is going to be with some form of undead. 36. It was during the Alder Wars, so it's at least 305 to 360 years old. And of course, we will annotate, the location of them on our map, on our notes, the dungeon. We got our size of the dungeon. Ooh, it's huge. 66 plus 50 rooms. That right there could let us know, okay, there's probably a lich or some real big nasty in there since we got such a huge dungeon. I doubt that huge dungeon would just be filled with skeletons and zombies. It's got some big nasty in there. And then, of course, we can go ahead and roll and see how many numbers of rooms we got to deal with. 9, 20, 32 plus 50. 62 rooms. And it's a big dungeon. Looks like our character's going to be stuck there for a while. It was originally a temple. Who built it? It was built by some type of bandit chief for survival. Well, okay, you might think at that point the temple is probably some deity of thievery. History of the dungeon. What happened there? Why is the bandit guy not there? The builders died of hunger. And we don't need to roll on inhabitants because we happen to know, well, this is going to be our undead. And to find it, it's alongside decaying statue of the founder. Now, with that done, we've got our notes. Now, at this point, you're going to want to stop, take a look at your notes, and first see if you want to change anything. I mean, after all, it's your game. You're playing solo. If you don't want it to be an outpost, you want it to be a real village, then you change it. If you don't like the cunning despot leader, you can change it. You're obviously free to change anything you want here, whether it has anything to do with the village or initial dungeon for your tastes. For purposes of this video, I don't think I'm going to change anything. But one thing I do want to look at is my map again. I'm looking at the map. Sorry for that glare. There's my village, there's my dungeon. Now, I'm sitting there thinking, it's kind of close to the forest, but not. And we do have a forester here. So, we could change that there's not a forester there. But I'm going to keep it as a forester. My idea is the people travel up here, collect the wood, and come back and do their craftsman trade to make great wooden items, whether it's spears or maybe they're good house builders or something. I don't know. And then we, of course, got our dungeon. Excuse me, I have a technical difficulty I got to take care of. Alright, I think I got a technical difficulty. Battery's running low. But that's okay. I can shoot this in many different formats. So, anyway, we got our village here. We decided to make a little story behind it. And now, the next step. The next step is, let's take a look at whatever we're going to use as our oracles, as our emulators, or whatever. Let's just, for the sake of argument, we're going to use the Game Master Emulator deck. If we have questions we want to ask about anything we've set up, we'll ask those questions of the Oracle and see what kind of extra details it gives us. Now, once you're done with that little exercise, figure that everything about this village that you've written up and everything about this dungeon you've written up stuff that the PCs will know. After all, they've lived in this place a long time, so they know about the situation of the village. They know about the basics of this dungeon. So now let's start working on the Hexcrawl portion. It is the prerogative of a DM, especially a solo DM, to make changes. And I decided I was going to make some changes. First change I made was I went ahead and made it a full-fledged village to give it more institutions. Die rolls gave us 2 foresters, 4 millers, a smith, an inn, and a temple. I then decided that I wanted to name the village and the dungeon, as well as figure out who the temple is to. So, first thing I did is I grabbed my Iron Sworn book, flipped through the back, or flipped to where the oracles are. find that page for you. Boop, 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 boop. Quick settlement name generator. And then there's also settlement name. I went ahead and rolled, and I got first meet. It was an historical event. What happened here? What place or practice commemorates this event? First meet. I then decided for the name of the dungeon, it'd be some type of barrow, since we know we have undead. I wound up getting Bleak Barrow. Where's Bleak? Where's Bleak? Bleak Barrow. So that became the name of the dungeon. And then when I sat there and thought about it, I was like, okay, well, there's a bandit chief here that built something underneath the temple. And I'm like, I wanted to see the name of the bandit chief. It just so happens, as I reached for my Ironsworn book, I looked at my cards and for the GMA, and if you see here was the name Oakley. So hence it became Oakley's Bleak Barrow. I then went ahead and was trolling through the Forbidden Lands book to figure out the temple, and I decided, okay, the party needs a place of rest. So I came up with Flow, and as I read the description, it was talking about that this is primarily an elven deity. So I'm like, oh, okay, so perhaps this will be an elven community or have strong ties to the elves. So I went ahead and just annotated here that the temple is to the goddess of flow, and this is primarily inhabited by elves. So that was the changes I made. Now we'll go ahead and get into the hexcrawl part of this video. Alright, when it comes to hex crawling, first thing you want to do is to break down the 24-hour day into segments. Those segments will determine when you make your rolls, what rolls you're going to make, and those also make good checkpoints to do your random encounter checks. Now, Forbidden Lands breaks your segments down into 4 cycles. There are 4 cycles throughout the day. As I look through the Fantasy Age, and it talks about healing and whatnot and resting, for hit points it uses 6 hours. For magic points it says 8 hours. So the first thing I did was, to keep it in line with Forbidden Lands, I just arbitrarily changed that rule that mages will gain their magic points based on a 6-hour cycle as opposed to the 8-hour cycle they say in here. That way it's in line with the hit point cycle and also works well with the structure from Forbidden Lands. As we look through the Forbidden Lands, it breaks your day down into the quarters of the day: morning, day, evening, and night. The things you can do throughout the day are hike, lead the way, keep watch, forage, hunt, fish, make camp, rest, sleep, and explore. We're going to take a look at hiking. Hiking's the easiest one. It says here that when you hike on open terrain, you can cover 2 hexagons a quarter on foot, 3 on horseback. If it's difficult terrain, you can do 1 hexagon per quarter and 1 hexagon per quarter on horseback. So when you look at your map, you can tell how far you can travel in one day. It talks about if you do a forced march. If you do a forced march, it requires you to make an endurance roll. Failure means you suffer 1 point to your agility and are unable to hike during the quarter of the day. Well, when I look at the rules for Fantasy Age, well, that's simple to convert. That would become a Constitution stamina check. And instead of suffering 1 point of agility, you will suffer 1d6 points of damage. That will represent hitting the branches, tripping over terrain, general fatigue, things of that nature. And if you're in a real rush, you can hike for a 4th quarter of a day, in which case you must again roll an endurance as outlined above, but the roll gets a -2 penalty. when I look at the game mechanics, the best thing I can do as far as converting that over is simply double the penalty. So instead of it being an average challenge, I think it becomes a challenging challenge. So I would just simply make an average check at a -4, which turns out to be the equivalent of, I believe it's challenging. I don't have the DM screen in front of me for Fantasy Age in front of me right now. Give me a second, maybe I can find it, but for now, we'll just go with doubling the penalties. And with that in mind, it also lets me know that whenever I see an ability score adjustment in here, or penalty to the roll, just double it. Now we get to Lead the Way. Lead the Way talks about doing a survival pathfinder check with penalties to the roll, whether it's light or dark outside, if your characters do not have some form of night vision. Well, a survival pathfinder check literally turns into a navigation check in Fantasy Age. That would actually become an intelligence, I believe it's an intelligence check. Yes, intelligence navigation, planning and following a road or route from one place to another. And again, if we ever have to suffer the darkness penalty, well, it becomes a -4. Mishaps. I'll come back to the mishaps later. Keeping watch. You always have to have someone keeping watch. Make sure that you know, a lookout. You don't get ambushed. If the die roll indicates that there's an encounter, simply make a perception check versus the other guy's dexterity/stealth check. Work under the assumption that the monsters are probably moving through stealthy anyway, unless the monster is obviously one that doesn't care about stealth. Then just make it a simple average check. Foraging, hunting. This would convert to a natural lore check in Fantasy Age. Hunting as well would be a natural lore check. If you decide to actually use this chart here for what type of creature you come across, again, double the penalty or difficulty here, or double the bonus if you have the appropriate, if you're coming across a mouse, obviously your difficulty goes 1 point higher, it will actually be 2 points higher. You're going up against something, well actually this is the other way around. A mouse in this case would be easier to get. So you get a +1 penalty, +2 penalty to your, or +2 bonus to your roll. Another +2 bonus to your roll. -2, -2, no change. Again, you have hunting mishaps. We'll get to those later. Fishing would also be a natural lore check. You might even want to add the appropriate skills of hunting and fishing to natural lore if you feel that that is required. You can always do that. Make camp, that would also be a natural lore roll. And then of course you're resting, you're sleeping and exploring. We don't have to really cover that. Your character sleeps, gets her hit points back. Now, all right, now we're going to go ahead and discuss mishaps. If your character fails to make the check, then this is where something bad can happen. Now here, depending on my mood, I'll split it up. Sometimes I will roll on this chart and just convert what I see here, if there's anything statistic-wise or mechanic-wise, to Fantasy Age. Otherwise, I can role play out the quicksand, the block terrain, getting lost, etc. For keeping watch, if you fail that check and you happen to have an encounter, well then they ambush you as opposed to you ambushing them. Foraging mishaps, again, you can roll on this chart. Depending on the season, you can get a bonus or penalty. In spring, you'd have a minus, your difficulty would be lowered by 2 because I'm doubling this. In autumn, it's +2. In winter, you're looking at a -4 on your check. Again, you have the various mishap tables, but what I mean by it can go 2 different ways is 1, I can utilize these charts, or 2, just ask our good friend the Mythic Game Emulator what bad thing happens and then convert it to something appropriate for the situation in the context of your adventure. If it's making camp error, then you can look at this list here for making camp. Where's making camp? There we go. Here you have like spoiled water, rotten food, bad campsite, downpour, fire dies, or fire. If this does not come up with something appropriate, make it up. Or you can use this chart. Now, Forbidden Lands does come with its own random encounter chart. If, however, you don't have Forbidden Lands, and again, refer to your Mythic game emulator for what the encounter is. When you've broken your game down into how many segments there are, in this case 4, there'd be 4 chances each day for a possible encounter. And I can either use these charts here, or I can just grab my Mythic game emulator deck and determine what the likelihood of an encounter is. Obviously, if I'm really, really close to the dungeon, it's more than likely, probably very likely, that I'll come across an encounter. The further away I am from civilization, the more unlikely, very unlikely, or maybe even near impossible. So in this case, let's just say we have a chaos factor of 5, and we want to see if we're going to have an encounter. We simply grab our emulator cards, give them a quick shuffle. I got some of the other cards mixed in here, but that's okay. Let's say we're real near the dungeon. We have a very likely chance that we're going to come across an encounter, and any yes will do. So mix. And if you know anything about these cards, you occasionally have to flip them over. So we'll flip over some random ones, give it another good mix. And we draw, according to this, we draw 3 cards, and any single yes will give us an encounter. Boom, we know we have an encounter. And then of course you can either use your chart, your emulator, your monster list, whatever, to determine what type of encounter you just came across. And this is just a copy of my notes. Lead the way, use navigation skill at average TN. You could adjust this if you wanted to, depending on the type of terrain. Keep watch is a perception versus the monster stealth. Hunt and fish, natural lore, double the bonus or penalties versus the average TN. Oh, and the other thing I came up with is using the stunt die to determine the amount of food or the amount of fish that you find. Make camp, obviously that's a natural lore check, and then stand guard is perception versus possible enemy stealth. And that's pretty much how you do the Hexcrawl. As your characters go through what the day is, make the appropriate checks for their navigation, perception, natural lore, whatever the case may be. Probably keep a little marker or a cube or something to indicate where you are, or just write notes down in your notebook to determine, okay, this square is where I came across the ogre, this square is where I came across, you know, the wandering cultists, whatever the case may be, and just go from there. That's hex crawling in a nutshell. If you have any questions, feel free to put them below, and I will see you in my next video. Until then, happy gaming.